In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who'll tell you the worst planet in the Imperium isn't the one that kills you fastest. Every world kills you eventually. That's the arrangement we're all born into, the fine print none of us agreed to. The worst is the one that keeps you alive just long enough to understand exactly what's being done to you. To watch it happen to the people standing next to you first. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Vedden Strave, born on Crucivael, a world you've never heard of, and he'll tell you that's the point. No reputation like Catachan or Krieg. Just a line on a tithe ledger, orbiting a dying red star that smears rust across the sky. The air is technically breathable, the word technically carrying every ounce of weight it can hold. A place where the killing gases have names the people gave them, because the Mechanicus only ever gave them numbers. He grew up in a world that looks like a wound, never once asking why the suffering was so precise. Then he found his father's data slate. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. You want to know what the worst planet in the Imperium is? I can tell you. It is not the one that kills you fastest. Every world in the Emperor's domain kills you eventually. That is the arrangement we are all born into, the fine print none of us agreed to. No, the worst planet is the kind that keeps you alive just long enough to understand exactly what is being done to you, to feel every stage of it, to watch it happen to the people standing next to you first, so that by the time your turn comes, you have already lived it a dozen times over in your skull. My name is Vedden Strave, and I was born on Crucivael. I know what you are thinking. Never heard of it. That is the point. The famous death worlds, the ones with names that make recruiters flinch and administratum clerks reach for their recaf. Those places at least have the dignity of reputation. Fenris, Krieg, names that mean something. Names that carry weight because someone at some point decided those worlds were interesting enough to write about. Crucivael was never interesting. It was just a line on a tithe ledger. A designation in some Mechanicus archive, a number attached to a mineral output quota that had to be met every 37 Terran standard months, or someone in a red robe would send a very politely worded death sentence disguised as a logistical reassessment. Let me tell you about my home. Crucivael sits in the Gellar Reach, a stretch of space that most navigators describe as unremarkable, which in navigator language means they did not lose anyone to the warp getting there. The planet itself orbits a bloated red star called Morhiven, and I mention this because Morhiven matters. The star is dying. Has been for longer than the Imperium has existed on Crucivael, and a dying red star does things to a planet. It bathes everything in a light that makes noon look like someone smeared rust across the sky. The shadows are wrong. They stretch too long, too dark, even in the middle of the working cycle. You grow up on Crucivael. You grow up in a world that looks like a wound, but the light is the least of your concerns. Crucivael has an atmosphere that is technically breathable. That word, technically, is doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. The air is a chemical cocktail that changes composition depending on where you are, what altitude, what time of the geological cycle. Near the surface, in the valleys and the lowland basins, the atmosphere is thick with vapors that rise from the planet's crust. Acidic compounds, metallite particulates, and a dozen other substances that the Mechanicus catalogued with long numerical designations, and the rest of us catalogued by what they did to your body. There was a yellow vapor we called rotgut that attacked your stomach lining if you breathed it long enough. A greenish haze called weeper that made your eyes bleed within minutes of unprotected exposure. And the worst one, The one that came up from the deep fissures in waves you could sometimes see rolling across the basin floor like a slow tide, was a colorless gas we called grandmother. Because it killed you gently, you felt warm, sleepy, comfortable, and then your lungs stopped working and you were gone. And the expression on the dead faces was always peaceful, which was the most obscene part of the whole thing. Nothing on Crucivael deserved to look peaceful. The planet's crust is unstable. I do not mean that in the way a geologist might politely note some seismic activity. I mean the ground moves, constantly. Fissures open up in the basins, some of them narrow enough to step over, some of them wide enough to swallow a chimera transport. They open without warning. They release superheated chemical vapor from whatever is boiling beneath the mantle, and then they close again, sometimes within hours, sometimes never. The ground on Crucivael is not solid. It is a suggestion, a temporary arrangement that the planet tolerates for a while before changing its mind. And because the Imperium is what it is, because the machinery of mankind requires fuel, and that fuel is measured in human misery per metric ton, someone at some point looked at this screaming, corroding, geologically suicidal world and said, "Yes, we will put people here." Because beneath the shifting crust, deep in the fissure networks where the heat and pressure and chemical reactions had been doing their work for millions of years, there were deposits of a crystalline compound called kelastrine. I did not know that word until I was 14. For most of my childhood, I just knew it as glass, because that is what it looked like when the miners brought it up. Pale, almost translucent shards that caught the red light of Moorhaven and held it, refracted it into colors I did not have names for. Beautiful, actually. The only beautiful thing on the entire planet. And naturally, it was the thing that kept us there. Kelastrine was used in the manufacture of Gellar field components. Without kelastrine, the Mechanicus could not produce the devices that kept ships sane during warp transit. Without Gellar fields, the Imperium's shipping lanes collapsed. Without shipping lanes, worlds starved, armies went unsupplied, the whole vast rotting machine ground to a halt. So we stayed, and we mined, and we died. The human population of Crucivael at the time I was born was approximately 600,000. I say approximately because nobody counted with any real accuracy. The Administratum census was conducted every 12 years by a delegation that arrived, spent as little time as possible on the surface, and left with numbers that were at best optimistic and at worst fictional. 600,000 souls crammed into a chain of hab complexes carved into the cliff faces of the Vedden Escarpment, the only geological formation on Crucivael stable enough to build on. A wall of basalt and ironite that ran for almost 300 kilometers along the edge of the largest basin. The habs were sealed. Every door, every window, every ventilation shaft sealed against the atmosphere outside. Air was recycled through filtration systems that the Mechanicus maintained with a diligence they did not extend to the people breathing it. Temperature was regulated in theory. Gravity was Crucivael's own, which was slightly heavier than Terran standard, just enough that your knees ached by the time you were 30 and your spine was compressing by 40. I was born in Habcost 12, a mid-level complex about 90 meters up the escarpment face. Not the worst place on the wall, not the best. The lowest habs, the ones closest to the basin floor, caught the worst of the vapor surges and the fissure eruptions. The highest habs, up near the ridgeline, got the wind, and on Crucivael the wind carried particulates that could strip paint off metal in a season and skin off bone in a bad storm. The middle was where you wanted to be, if wanting had anything to do with it. My parents did not choose Habcost 12. They were assigned there, the way everyone was assigned everything on Crucivael. The Mechanicus decided where you lived, what you did, when you did it, and in most cases when you stopped doing it because you were dead. My father was a man named Vedden Strave, and he was a seal keeper. That was his caste, his designation, his entire identity as far as the administratum was concerned. Seal keepers maintained the atmospheric barriers that kept the hab complexes habitable. Every seal, every gasket, every pressure membrane between the air inside and the death outside, that was a seal keeper's responsibility. It was not glamorous work. It was not even respected work, not really, though everyone understood on some unspoken level that if the seal keepers stopped doing their jobs, everyone died within hours. My father was a quiet man, methodical. He had hands like industrial tools, thick-fingered and scarred from decades of working with bonding compounds and corrosion-resistant polymers. He spoke in short sentences, did not waste words, and expressed affection primarily by making sure you were still alive at the end of each day. By Crucivael standards, he was an excellent father. My mother was Vedden Strave, and she died when I was 5. I should explain how, because it matters. Not because her death was unusual. Deaths on Crucivael were never unusual. They were as routine as the shift change klaxon. But the way she died is the way Crucivael kills most of its people, and understanding it is understanding the planet. Hab Karst 12 had a secondary ventilation junction on its lower level, a junction that connected to the external filtration system. The seal on that junction was maintained by a keeper named Utrecht Dan, a man who was, by all accounts, competent. He had maintained that seal for 11 years without incident. But Crucivael is a planet that punishes competence and complacence equally because the ground moves, and when the ground moves, the escarpment flexes, and when the escarpment flexes, the mounting points for the seals shift by fractions of a millimeter. Fractions that accumulate over months and years. Utrecht Dane had maintained his seal perfectly for 11 years, but the mountain beneath it had moved, and one morning during the 3rd shift, the seal failed. Not catastrophically. Not all at once. It started as a hairline breach, a whisper of outside air finding its way through a gap so small you could not have fit a blade into it. But a whisper was enough. The vapor that came through was weeper, the green compound, and it contaminated the air in the lower ventilation corridor before anyone realized what was happening. My mother was in that corridor. She was on her way to the nutrition dispensary on the lower level, a walk she made every morning. 23 people were in that corridor when the weeper got in. 14 died. My mother was one of the 14. The others survived because they were far enough from the breach point that the contamination was diluted by the time it reached them. My mother was close. She would have felt the burning in her eyes first, then the bleeding, then the swelling that closed her throat. The Medici report said she died within 4 minutes. I do not know if that is fast or slow for weeper exposure. I was 5 years old, and I remember very little about her, except a feeling, a warmth, that I associated with being held, and then the absence of that warmth. My father did not grieve, or rather, he did not grieve in any way I could recognize. The day after my mother died, he went back to his seals. He checked every junction in Hab Karst 12, all 67 of them, in a single shift. He did it again the next day, and the day after that. He did it every day for the rest of his life, and I think that was his grief. Not tears, not prayers, not the cold binary rites the tech priests intoned over the recyclamation vats. Just work. The same seals, checked and rechecked as if he could retroactively save her by making sure no other seal ever failed on his watch. I grew up in the wake of that. A boy in a sealed metal box on the side of a cliff, breathing recycled air that tasted like iron and old sweat, watching his father disappear into the maintenance tunnels every morning and return every evening with nothing to say. The other children in Hab Karst 12 were much the same. We were a quiet generation, which was not unusual. Children on Crucivael learned very early that noise attracted attention, and attention on Crucivael was rarely the kind you wanted. The Mechanicus overseers who administered the Hab complexes were not cruel in the way that, say, a penal colony warden is cruel. They were indifferent, which is worse. Cruelty at least acknowledges that you exist. Indifference means you are a component, and components do not require acknowledgement. They require function. So we functioned. I went to the Schola, which was a room on the 4th level of Hab Karst 12, where a woman named Instructor Velgate taught 60 children the skills they would need for their assigned castes. Reading, basic numerics, the Catechism of the Omnissiah, naturally, because the Mechanicus held that a component which did not revere the machine god was a component that could not be trusted to function, and caste-specific training, which for me, as the son of a seal keeper, meant learning the properties of atmospheric compounds, the maintenance schedules for different seal types, and the emergency protocols for breach containment. I was 8 years old, learning how to calculate vapor diffusion rates. Other children in the Schola were learning mineral extraction techniques, or atmospheric monitoring, or the operation of the massive filtration engines that kept our air clean enough to breathe. There was no idle time. Idle time was waste, and waste was a sin against the Omnissiah, and sins against the Omnissiah were punished in ways that made Crucivael's atmosphere look forgiving. But I will tell you something about growing up in a place like that, something that I think outsiders never understand. You do not know it is terrible. You have no frame of reference. The sealed corridors, the recycled air, the constant low hum of the filtration systems, the red light filtering through the observation ports, the distant rumble of the planet rearranging itself beneath you. All of that is just what the world is. I did not know that other planets had open skies you could walk under without a rebreather. I did not know that on some worlds, children played in something called rain, which was water falling from the sky that did not dissolve your skin. I did not know that there were places where the ground stayed where you put it. Crucivael was the world, and the world was Crucivael, and the misery was invisible because it was everything. That is the trick, you see. That is how the worst planet in the Imperium works. It does not need walls or chains or overseers with shock mauls to keep you in place. It just needs to be the only thing you have ever known. You cannot escape a prison you do not recognize as one. I became a seal keeper at the age of 12. That was standard. On Crucivael, childhood ended when the Mechanicus decided you were large enough to be useful, and at 12 I was tall for my age, with my father's heavy hands and my mother's. Well, I am told I had my mother's eyes, but since I barely remember her face, that particular inheritance was wasted on me. The induction was simple. My father took me to his section of the maintenance tunnels, handed me a bonding applicator, and pointed at a seal junction. "Fix that," he said. I fixed it. He pointed at the next one. "Fix that." I fixed that too. By the end of the first shift, my hands were raw, my back ached from the heavier gravity, and I understood that this was going to be my life. Every day, every shift, for however long Crucivael decided to let me keep breathing. The maintenance tunnels were a world within a world. They ran through the walls of the Hab complexes like veins through flesh, narrow passages barely wide enough for a grown man to move through without turning sideways. The lighting was minimal, amber strips spaced too far apart that created pools of dirty orange light separated by stretches of genuine darkness. The air in the tunnels was different from the air in the main Hab corridors, thinner, colder. You could taste the outside in it, a faint chemical bitterness that sat on the back of your tongue and never quite went away. That was because the tunnels ran along the exterior walls, right behind the seals, and even the best seal let trace amounts of Crucivael's atmosphere seep through. It was not enough to kill you, not quickly anyway, but seal keepers had a shorter life expectancy than any other caste on the escarpment except the miners themselves, and nobody talked about why, because talking about it would not change anything. My father and I worked in silence. That suited both of us. He was not a man who taught with words. He taught by demonstration, and I learned by watching. And between us we maintained all 67 seal junctions across the 4 levels of Hab Cars 12. No other sealkeeper family covered an entire Hab. Most sections were 30-40 junctions at most. But my father had taken on additional sections after my mother's death, and nobody had ever reassigned them. And so the Straves maintained 67 junctions, where another family would have maintained half that. Each junction required daily inspection, weekly recalibration of the pressure membranes, and monthly replacement of the corrosion-resistant gaskets that formed the primary barrier against the outside atmosphere. The gaskets were manufactured in the fabrication bays on the upper levels, turned out by servitors from a polymer compound that the Mechanicus assured us was rated for 900 hours of continuous exposure to Crucivael's standard atmospheric mix. In practice, the gaskets degraded in 600 hours, sometimes less depending on the local vapor composition. Nobody complained about the discrepancy. Complaining to the Mechanicus about material quality was like complaining to the sky about the color of the light. The sky did not care, and the Mechanicus cared even less. I should tell you about what was outside the seals, because you need to understand that Crucivael was not just a poisonous atmosphere with bad geology. There were things living in that atmosphere, things that had evolved over millions of years in conditions that should have been hostile to any biological process, and had come out the other side as organisms so perfectly adapted to toxicity that they were, in their own hideous way, magnificent. The most common were the kelk. I do not know what a biologist would call them. The Mechanicus classified them as Crucivael native macroparasitoids, which is a very clean and clinical way to describe something that looked like a knot of wet sinew the size of a man's torso, moved by contracting and expanding its body in a way that reminded me of a heart beating in slow motion, and fed by attaching itself to any surface that radiated heat and slowly dissolving it with secreted acids. The Kelch were drawn to the Hab complexes because we were warm. 600,000 human bodies, the heat of the recyclers, the energy signatures of the filtration engines, all of it bleeding through the walls in infrared that the Kelch could sense from kilometers away. They clung to the exterior of the Habs like tumors on a lung, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, pressing their bodies against the walls and exuding acid that ate into the metal over days and weeks. A single Kelch was a nuisance. A colony of them could compromise a wall section in a month. Killing them was not difficult. They were slow, fragile if you could get past the acid secretion, and they died easily to heat or chemical countermeasures. The problem was that they bred faster than they could be killed. Every time a maintenance crew went outside in sealed suits to clear a Kelch colony off a wall section, a new colony was already forming somewhere else. It was a war of attrition that Crucivael's biology was always going to win, because the planet had time and numbers and we had neither. Then there were the strata borers. These were worse than the kelk because you could not see them. They lived in the rock itself, tunneling through the escarpment in colonies that the Mechanicus estimated numbered in the billions. Each individual borer was tiny, barely the length of a finger joint, an eyeless worm with a crystalline head that secreted an enzyme capable of dissolving basalt. Alone, a single borer was nothing, but they did not work alone. They tunneled in coordinated patterns, following chemical signals that we did not fully understand, creating networks of microscopic passages through the rock that weakened the structural integrity of the escarpment over decades. Every few years, a section of the cliff face would simply give way, shearing off and taking whatever hab complex was bolted to it down into the basin below. I witnessed 2 such collapses in my time on Crucivael. The first took hab cost 6, 4,000 people. The second took hab cost 21, and most of hab cost 20, almost 9,000 people. Both collapses happened without warning. One moment the hab was there, solid and sealed, and full of people going about their shifts. The next moment it was rubble falling through clouds of yellow vapor into a fissure that had opened to receive it like a mouth. And then there were the things in the deep fissures, the ones that the miners encountered down in the extraction tunnels. I never went that deep. Seal keepers stayed in the hab complexes. But the miners talked, when they talked at all, about organisms in the deep rock that defied easy description. Nobody understood what they were, and the Mechanicus did not encourage curiosity on the subject. This was the world outside our seals. Acid fog, geological instability, parasitic organisms that ate through our walls, and deep horrors that we pretended did not exist because acknowledging them would have required doing something about them, and there was nothing to be done. We were 600,000 people on a cliff face, surrounded by death in every direction, and our continued existence depended entirely on the thin polymer gaskets and pressure membranes that people like my father and I maintained with our scarred hands and our bonding applicators. Sleep well, citizen of the Imperium. Your Gellar fields are operational because someone on Crucivael died to dig out the kelastrine that made them possible. My adolescence, such as it was, consisted of work, sleep, nutrition paste, and the slow accumulation of scars on my hands. I do not want to paint this as some grim martyrdom. It was not. It was ordinary. Every child in Habcost 12 was doing the same thing in their own caste, learning their trade, becoming useful, replacing the adults who were wearing out. The miners' children went into the extraction tunnels. The vapor readers' children learned to interpret the atmospheric monitoring equipment. The fabricators' children learned to operate the polymer presses and the servitor maintenance bays. We were components being manufactured to specification, and the specification was survival. I had one friend. His name was Orath Denet, and he was a miner's son, which meant that in the rigid social taxonomy of Crucivael's hab complexes, he was beneath me. Not by much. Seal keepers were not exactly aristocracy, but the castes existed, and they mattered, and the fact that Orath and I spent our off shifts together in the corridor junction between levels 3 and 4 of Hab Karst 12 was technically a violation of social protocol that nobody bothered to enforce because nobody had the energy. Orath was shorter than me, wiry in the way that miners' children tended to be, all dense muscle and no fat, because the nutrition allotments for mining families were calibrated for maximum physical output, not comfort. He talked more than I did, which was not difficult since I had inherited my father's economy with words. But Orath talked in a way I liked. He noticed things. He would sit in that corridor junction, eating his nutrition paste with the slow deliberation of someone making a bad meal last. And he would say things like, "Have you noticed that the tremors are getting more frequent?" Or, "Did you hear that Habcost 9 lost pressure on their western face again, 3rd time this quarter?" He collected facts the way other people collected grievances, not to do anything with them, just to have them, to know. I think that habit is what eventually destroyed him, but I will get to that. The other person who shaped my years on Crucivael was a woman named Instructor Velgate, the same woman who had taught me in the Schola. She was old by Crucivael standards, which meant she was in her 50s. She had outlived 2 husbands, both minors, and had a lung condition that made her breathing sound like air being forced through a damaged filter, which it essentially was. Velgate was not kind. Kindness was not a survival trait on Crucivael, and she had survived longer than most. But she was precise, and she was honest, and in a world built on information that the Mechanicus controlled and parceled out in exactly the amounts they deemed sufficient, Velgate had somehow accumulated more knowledge than she was supposed to have. She knew things about Crucivael's atmospheric cycles that contradicted the official Mechanicus models. She knew things about the stratoborers that the xenobiological surveys had never published. And she knew things about kelastrine that I would not learn until much later, things that would reframe everything I thought I understood about my world. Velgate never taught me these things directly. She was too careful for that. She taught by implication, by asking questions that she already knew the answers to, and waiting to see if anyone else could figure them out. Most of her students could not. I could sometimes, and Orith could more often than me. And I think Velgate recognized in both of us something that she valued more than obedience, which was the capacity to look at the world and see it for what it actually was, rather than what we had been told it was. That capacity would cost all 3 of us more than any of us could have imagined. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the tithe. Every 37 Terran Standard months, the tithe ships came to Crucivael. They arrived in orbit, 3 or 4 bulk haulers escorted by a naval frigate that stayed only long enough to make sure the haulers were loaded and departed. The tithe was twofold. The primary tithe was kelastrine, raw crystalline material packed into sealed containers and lifted to orbit by the heavy cargo shuttles that the Mechanicus maintained in a facility at the northern end of the escarpment. The secondary tithe was people. The Imperial Guard needed bodies, and Crucivael, like every other inhabited world in the Imperium, was required to provide them. The Guard tithe was not large by the standards of more populous worlds, a few thousand each cycle, drawn from the lowest castes, the ones whose labor was most easily replaced. Miners, mostly. Sometimes laborers from the fabrication bays. Never seal keepers, because seal keepers were specialists, and the Mechanicus did not willingly part with specialist labor. The tithe was administered with the same mechanical indifference that characterized everything the Mechanicus did on Crucivael. Names were selected, families were notified, and on tithe day, the selected individuals reported to the transit hub on level 1 of Hab Karst 1, where they were processed, decontaminated, given a standard-issue Imperial Guard uniform, and marched on 2 shuttles that took them to the haulers in orbit. They left. They did not come back. Nobody expected them to. The Guard was a one-way door, and everyone on Crucivael understood that, and most of the people selected for the tithe went without protest because the alternative, staying on Crucivael, was not obviously better. Orath was terrified of the tithe. His father had been taken 2 cycles before we met, and Orath had grown up with the understanding that he was next. Miners' sons became miners, and miners were tithe eligible, and the selection algorithms that the Mechanicus used to choose names were opaque enough that you could never be sure you were safe. He talked about it sometimes in that quiet corridor junction, in the way that people talk about things they cannot control but cannot stop thinking about either. I told him he was worrying about a problem that had not happened yet. He told me I sounded like my father. I took that as a compliment. He did not mean it as one. The years passed the way years pass on a world where nothing changes except the ways things can kill you. I turned 14, 16, 18. My hands grew harder and more scarred. My lungs developed the faint, persistent rasp that every seal keeper eventually acquired, the first sign of chronic exposure to trace atmospheric contaminants that seeped through the junctions we maintained. My father's rasp was worse. By the time I was 18, he could not climb to the upper maintenance tunnels without stopping to rest twice, and his breath came in shallow, labored pulls that sounded like a filtration pump on its last cycle. He was 46 years old. On most Imperial worlds, that would have been middle age. On Crucivael, it was borrowed time. I took over more of his sections. He let me, which was as close as he ever came to admitting that he was failing. By my 19th year, I was maintaining 60 of the 67 junctions in our section by myself, and my father handled the remaining 7, the easy ones, the ones on the lower levels where the tunnels were wider and the climb was less punishing. We still did not talk much, but there was a night, about 6 months before everything changed, when I came back from the tunnels to find him sitting on his sleep cot in our quarters, staring at the wall with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I asked if he was all right. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "The tremors are wrong." That was all. The tremors are wrong. I asked him what he meant, and he shook his head and said nothing else. And the next morning he went back to his 7 junctions, and I went back to my 60, and we did not discuss it. But I thought about it. And once I started thinking about it, I could not stop, because my father was right. The tremors were wrong. Let me explain. Crucivael's seismic activity followed patterns, not predictable patterns in the way that a chronometer is predictable, but patterns nonetheless, rhythms that you learn to feel in your body after enough years on the escarpment. The deep tremors, the ones that came from the planet's mantle, had a cadence. They built over weeks, reached a peak, subsided, and the cycle repeated. Seal keepers knew these rhythms better than anyone because our work depended on them. You scheduled your major maintenance around the seismic cycles, replacing gaskets and recalibrating membranes during the quiet periods, doing emergency checks during the active phases. It was not precise, but it was functional. You developed an instinct for it, the way a sailor develops an instinct for weather. And the instinct was telling me that something was different. The deep tremors were coming more frequently. The quiet periods between cycles were shorter. And there was a new vibration, something I had never felt before, a low, sustained pulse that did not fit any pattern I knew. It was not constant. It came in bursts, irregular, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes only minutes. It felt artificial, which was a word I used reluctantly because I could not justify it with anything except a feeling. But it was there, a wrongness in the rhythm of the planet, like a second heartbeat that did not belong. Orath noticed it too. Of course he did. Orath noticed everything. He came to our corridor junction one evening with a stack of data slates he had borrowed, stolen, or otherwise acquired from the atmospheric monitoring station on level 7, and he spread them across the floor between us and said, "Look at this." The data slates showed atmospheric composition readings from the last 3 years, and even my limited understanding of atmospheric chemistry was enough to see what he was pointing at. The concentration of acidic compounds in the basin air was increasing, not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger any automated alarm, but steadily, measurably, in a trend that the monitoring equipment had been recording, but that nobody, as far as Orath could tell, had been analyzing. More acid in the air meant faster degradation of our seals. Faster degradation meant more breaches. More breaches meant more deaths. It was a simple equation, and the variable driving it was getting worse, and nobody was talking about it. I asked Orath where he had gotten the data slates. He told me that Instructor Velgate had suggested he look at the monitoring station's records, that she had mentioned in her oblique way that the numbers were interesting. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach, the kind of certainty that comes not from knowing the answer, but from realizing that someone else already knows it and has been waiting for you to catch up. We went to see Velgate. She lived in quarters on level 5 of Habcast 12, a single room that she had occupied alone since her second husband died in the extraction tunnels 8 years earlier. The room was small, even by Crucivael standards, and every surface was covered in data slates, hand-drawn diagrams, and notes written in a shorthand that I could not read. She was sitting in the middle of it all when we arrived, breathing in that labored way of hers, and she looked at us with an expression that I can only describe as tired satisfaction, like she had been waiting for this visit for a long time and was relieved it had finally come. She did not ask why we were there. She already knew. Instead, she asked us a question. "How old do you think Crucivael's atmospheric toxicity is?" I said I did not know. Orath said millions of years, which was the standard answer, the one taught in the Schola, the one that the Mechanicus included in every geological survey. Velgate smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Try again," she said. "This time think about what would have to be true if the toxicity were really that old." Orath and I looked at each other. I did not understand what she was getting at. Orath, though. Orath, with his habit of collecting facts and following them to their conclusions. Orath, who noticed everything. Orath got there before I did. His face changed. "The strataborers," he said. Velgate nodded. Here is what Orath had realized, and what Velgate had apparently known for years. The strataborers, the billions of tiny crystalline-headed worms that tunneled through the escarpment and caused the periodic cliff collapses, were not native to Crucivael, or rather they were native, but they had not always been what they were. The official Mechanicus surveys classified them as a deep lithosphere organism that had evolved over geological time to process the basalt of the Corvedon escarpment. But if that were true, if the borers had been tunneling through the escarpment for millions of years, the escarpment should not exist anymore. The math did not work. The borers reproduced too fast, tunneled too efficiently. If they had been at it for geological ages, they would have reduced the entire escarpment to gravel long before the Imperium ever arrived. The only way the numbers made sense was if the borers had not been at their current population density for very long. A few centuries, maybe. Not millions of years. Something had changed the borers, accelerated their reproduction, increased their numbers to a level that was actively threatening the escarpment's structural integrity. And the atmospheric toxicity. The same logic applied. Crucivael's geological surveys, the ones the Mechanicus allowed access to, described the atmospheric conditions as primordial, a consequence of the planet's formation and its volcanic activity. But the atmospheric compound concentrations were increasing on a timescale that was measurable within a human lifetime. Not geological drift. Not slow planetary change. Fast, measurable, accelerating change. Something was altering the atmospheric chemistry of Crucivael in real time. Velgate let us sit with that for a while. I remember the silence in her quarters, broken only by the ever-present hum of the filtration systems and the distant rumble of a tremor that I now heard differently. Then she told us the rest. She had been a vapor reader before she was an instructor. Years ago, before her lungs forced her into a less physically demanding role, she had worked in the atmospheric monitoring stations, and she had access to data that most citizens never saw, and in that data, she had found something that did not belong. Periodic chemical signatures in the deep fissure vapor emissions that were not consistent with natural geological processes, compounds that appeared in precise concentrations at regular intervals, as if they were being introduced into the planetary mantle from an external source. Catalytic agents, she called them. Compounds designed to accelerate chemical reactions in the deep rock, to increase pressure and temperature in the subsurface layers, to stimulate the geological processes that produced kelastrine. I remember the moment I understood what she was saying. I remember it because the world shifted, Not physically, not like the tremors, but in my head, in the way I saw everything around me. The seals I maintained, the gaskets that degraded too quickly, the acid fog that was getting worse, the tremors that were getting stronger, the stratoborers that were multiplying beyond any natural rate. My mother, dead in a ventilation corridor because a seal failed, because the escarpment shifted, because the ground was unstable, because someone was making it unstable, deliberately, as an industrial process. Velgate said that the Mechanicus had been injecting catalytic compounds into Crucivael's mantle through the deepest extraction shafts for at least 200 years. The compounds accelerated kelastrine crystallization, increasing the yield of the mineral deposits by a factor that she estimated at somewhere between 3 and 5. The side effects of this acceleration were everything we lived with: the increased atmospheric toxicity, the geological instability, the fissure eruptions, the changing chemical composition that was feeding the stratoborers and killing our seals and dissolving our lungs. All of it was a side effect. All of it was industrial waste from a process that the Mechanicus had implemented to squeeze more kelastrine out of the planet, faster, to meet quotas that had been rising steadily for 2 centuries. Crucivael was not a death world. It had been made into one. My mother did not die because the planet was inherently hostile. She died because a magos somewhere had calculated that increasing kelastrine output by a factor of 4 was worth the additional atmospheric contamination, and had signed off on a process that turned an already harsh but survivable mining world into a slow-motion execution chamber, and had done so with the full knowledge and approval of whoever sat above them in the Mechanicus hierarchy. The 600,000 people on the Vedden escarpment were not living on a death world. They were living inside a chemical reactor, and they were the expendable components. I asked Velgate why she had not told anyone. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked why the sky is red, and she said, "Who would I tell?" The Mechanicus runs Crucivael. The Administratum does not care. The Ministorum will tell you it is the Emperor's will. There is nobody to tell, Vedden. There is no authority in the Imperium that will weigh 600,000 mining workers against the kelastrine output that keeps the Gellar fields running on 10,000 ships. We are a rounding error in a calculation that was made before any of us were born. She was right. Knowing the truth changed nothing because there was nothing to be done with it. The Mechanicus would continue injecting their catalysts. The atmosphere would continue deteriorating. And we would continue maintaining our seals and dying in our corridors because the Imperium needed what Crucivael produced. I went back to my tunnels the next morning and checked my seals. All 67 of them. My father was already there, working his 7, breathing in that shallow, damaged way. I looked at him, at his scarred hands and his compressing spine and his corroding lungs, and I understood for the first time that he was not dying because Crucivael was a hard world. He was dying because someone in a red robe had decided that his death was an acceptable line item on a production spreadsheet. Orath took it differently. I went quiet. He went the opposite direction. Orath had always been the one who noticed things, collected facts, followed patterns. Now he had the biggest pattern of all, and it consumed him. He started talking to other miners. Carefully, at first, he would ask questions that seemed innocent but were not. Have you noticed the tremors getting stronger? Has anyone else seen the gasket replacement rate going up? Simple questions designed to plant seeds, to get people thinking about the same inconsistencies that he and I had noticed. And people listened because Orath was good at this. He had a way of presenting information that made you feel like you were discovering it yourself, like the conclusion was yours rather than his. I told him to be careful. He told me he was being careful. We were both lying. 3 months after Velgate told us the truth, the planet reminded us that it did not care about our internal struggles. The event that the Mechanicus later designated Seismic Incident 77 Crucivael occurred during the second shift on the 43rd day of the extraction cycle. I was in the maintenance tunnels on level 3 of Hab-Karst 12 when it happened. The first indication was a sound, or rather a cessation of sound. The constant low rumble that was the background noise of life on Crucivael, the tectonic grinding that you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, that sound stopped. For about 4 seconds there was silence. Absolute silence. I had never experienced it before. The planet had never been quiet in my entire life, and the sudden absence of its voice was more terrifying than any noise it had ever made. Then the ground dropped. Not shook, not trembled. Dropped. The floor of the maintenance tunnel fell away beneath me by what felt like a full meter, and I was airborne for a fraction of a second before gravity, Crucivael's heavy, punishing gravity, slammed me back down. The impact shattered the seal junction I had been inspecting and threw me against the tunnel wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs. The amber light strips went out. Emergency lumens kicked in, bathing everything in a dim red glow that made the dust in the air look like blood. And then the noise came back, all at once. Not the familiar rumble, but something deeper and louder and more violent, a sound that felt like the planet was tearing itself in half. Seismic Incident 7-7 was the largest geological event recorded on Crucivael in over a century. A fissure opened in the basin floor that ran for almost 40 kilometers, wider than anything in the geological record, and from that fissure came a superheated vapor eruption that engulfed the lower third of the Vedden escarpment in a wall of chemical fog so dense and so toxic that it overwhelmed the external filtration systems of every HAB complex below the 50-meter line. Hab-Karsts 3, 4, 5, and what remained of 6 after its earlier collapse were all below that line. 19,000 people. The fog hit them in minutes, forcing its way through every seal, every gasket, every pressure membrane, because no seal was designed to withstand that concentration of corrosive compounds. The filtration systems burned out, trying to process the contaminated air. Backup systems failed. Tertiary systems, where they existed, lasted minutes longer. 19,000 people died in under an hour, some from direct exposure to the fog, some from asphyxiation when their air supply was contaminated beyond any filtration capacity, some from structural collapse as the seismic activity shattered the mounting points that held the lower HABs to the escarpment face. I heard later that Hab-Karst 3 detached from the cliff wall entirely and fell into the fissure, 200 meters straight down into superheated vapor, and that the screaming was audible through the communication systems for 11 seconds before the signal cut out. Hab-Karst 12 was above the fog line. We survived, but surviving is a relative term on Crucivael. The seismic activity damaged seal junctions across every level of the complex, and for the next 72 hours, every seal keeper on the escarpment worked without sleep, without rest, patching and replacing and reinforcing, because if the seals failed while the atmospheric contamination was still elevated, we would join the 19,000. My father worked alongside me for the first 12 hours, then collapsed in a maintenance tunnel on level 2 and could not get up. I carried him back to our quarters and left him there and went back to the tunnels because the seals would not wait. When I returned 16 hours later, he was still on his cot, breathing in that terrible shallow way, and he looked at me and said, "Again, the tremors are wrong." And this time I said, I know, Father." And he closed his eyes and did not open them again for 9 hours, and when he woke, he went back to his 7 junctions as if nothing had happened. The aftermath of seismic incident 7-7 was chaos by Crucivael's austere standards. The Mechanicus dispatched additional servitor crews to repair the damaged hab complexes. The surviving population was redistributed across the remaining habs, increasing the density to levels that strained the life support systems. Nutrition allotments were reduced to compensate, work shifts were extended, and the mining continued because the mining always continued, because the kelastrine quota existed outside of any consideration for the people who met it. Orath was furious. Not the hot, visible fury of someone who might throw a punch or break something. A dense, compressed fury that I could see in his eyes every time I looked at him. 19,000 people, he said to me in our corridor junction, which was now also a sleeping space for 3 displaced families from the lower habs. 19,000, and they are increasing the shift length. I told him that the Mechanicus had to maintain output. He looked at me like I had said something obscene. They caused this, Vedden. The catalysts, the mantle injections. That fissure did not open because the planet decided to kill us. It opened because they have been destabilizing the crust for 2 centuries, and now the crust is giving way, and 19,000 people are dead because someone wanted to hit a production target. And the response is to work us harder, to mine more, to pump more catalysts into the ground and wait for the next one. He was right. I knew he was right. And I said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. Orath stopped being careful after that. He talked openly. Not to everyone, not on the public address systems or in the main corridors, but in the mining barracks, in the nutrition dispensaries, in the places where workers gathered between shifts. He talked. He shared what Velgate had told us. He shared the atmospheric data. He shared the math about the strata borers, and people listened not because they wanted to, but because 19,000 dead in a single hour has a way of making people receptive to explanations that they would have dismissed the day before. I do not know exactly how long it took for the Mechanicus to notice. On a world with a more sophisticated surveillance apparatus, it would have been days. Crucivael's monitoring systems were focused on atmospheric and geological data, not social behavior. The Mechanicus overseers were engineers, not arbites. They cared about mineral output, not morale. But eventually someone reported something, or a monitoring algorithm flagged an anomaly in communication patterns, or a loyal overseer overheard a conversation. The specifics do not matter. What matters is that 8 weeks after seismic incident 7-7, the Mechanicus responded. They came for Velgate first. I was not there when they took her. Orath told me about it afterward, his face pale, his hands shaking in a way I had never seen before. A squad of Skitari, the Mechanicus's military arm, had gone to her quarters on level 5, dismantled her door, and taken her. No announcement, no charges, no explanation. They took her data slates, her diagrams, her notes. They took everything, and then they took her, and she did not resist because she was a 53-year-old woman with failing lungs, and the Skitari were augmented soldiers with galvanic rifles and no capacity for hesitation. Orath said she was calm, that she walked with the Skitari without speaking, and that the last thing she did before they led her out of Hab-Karst 12 was look at Orath, who was watching from the corridor junction on level 4, and nod, just nod, as if to say, yes, this is what I expected. This is how it was always going to go. We never saw her again. The Mechanicus did not announce what happened to her. No trial, no sentencing, no public acknowledgement that she had ever existed. She simply vanished into whatever apparatus the Mechanicus used to deal with inconvenient knowledge, and the space where she had been closed over like flesh over a wound, and within a week it was as if she had never been there at all. I begged Orath to stop. I am not ashamed to admit that. I begged him. I told him that Velgate's disappearance was a warning, a clear and unambiguous message that the Mechanicus knew what was being said and was prepared to act on it. I told him that nothing he could do would change anything, that the Mechanicus controlled Crucivael absolutely, and that every person he talked to was another thread in a net that was closing around him. He listened. He nodded, and then he went back to the mining barracks and kept talking, because Orath had decided that silence was complicity, and he would rather be taken than be silent. I understood his position. I even respected it. But I did not share it because I was my father's son, and my father's lesson was survival, not principle. They came for Orath on a morning that was unremarkable in every other way. I was in the maintenance tunnels checking the junction on level 3 that I had repaired after seismic incident 7-7. I felt the vibration of boots through the tunnel floor before I heard anything, and I knew in the way that you know things on Crucivael, where your survival instincts are sharpened to a killing edge by necessity, that they were not coming for a routine inspection. I pressed myself into an alcove where a secondary conduit met the main tunnel, and I waited. And through the grillwork I saw 6 Skitarii moving in formation through the hab corridor below, and between them, hands bound with mag cuffs, was Orath. He was not struggling. His face was blank, emptied of the fury that had driven him for the past months, and in its place was something that I recognized because I had seen it on Velgate's face, and on the faces of the 19,000 as they were carried out of the lower habs in body bags. Acceptance. The understanding that the machine had made its decision, and there was no mechanism for appeal. He did not see me in the alcove. I stayed where I was until the Skitarii were gone, and then I went back to my junctions and finished my shift. And that evening I sat in the corridor junction where Orath and I had spent 1,000 off shifts talking, and I sat there alone. My father died 11 days later. Not dramatically, not in a seal breach or a seismic event, or any of the spectacular ways that Crucivael could end a life. He died in his sleep, on his cot, in our quarters on level 4. His lungs, corroded by 31 years of trace atmospheric exposure in the maintenance tunnels, simply stopped processing air efficiently enough to keep him alive. I found him in the morning, still in the position I had last seen him in the night before, and for a moment I thought he was sleeping because his face was relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake. But he was not sleeping. He was gone, and the stillness in the room was different from any stillness I had known, and I stood there looking at him and thinking, 31 years. 31 years of checking seals so that other people could breathe. And the air that killed him was air that did not have to be that bad. The atmospheric contamination that destroyed his lungs was a byproduct of a manufacturing process that someone had chosen to implement. My father did not die of natural causes. He was killed, slowly, over 3 decades, by a decision made in a Mechanicus laboratorium by people who would never know his name or see his face or understand that the number on their production spreadsheet was a human being who checked 67 seal junctions every day and loved his dead wife in the only way he knew how, and raised a son mostly in silence and never once complained about any of it. I processed his body through the standard recyclamation protocols. On Crucivael, the dead were rendered down for their mineral and organic components, which were fed back into the fabrication and nutrition systems. Efficiency. Waste nothing. I watched the servitors take him, and I felt nothing that I could identify as grief. It came later in the tunnels, when I reached for a bonding applicator, and my hand closed on the one he had used for 31 years, worn smooth by his grip. And I held it and felt the shape of his fingers in the wear patterns, and that was when I understood that he was gone and was not coming back, and that I was alone on a planet that had taken everything from me and would take me too, eventually, when it got around to it. I decided to leave, not to escape. There was no escaping Crucivael in any meaningful sense, but I could leave. I could volunteer for the tithe. Seal keepers were exempt from the normal tithe selection, and the Mechanicus did not willingly release specialist labor. But the Guard took volunteers regardless of caste, and after Seismic Incident 7-7, the Mechanicus had bigger problems than one seal keeper walking to the transit hub. Or perhaps they wanted me gone. I had been seen with Orath. I had been seen with Velgate. A quiet departure was cleaner than a third arrest. It was a one-way door. Everyone knew that. But every door on Crucivael was one way. At least this one led somewhere else. I reported to the transit hub in Hab Karst 1 on the morning of the next tithe cycle. I brought nothing. There was nothing to bring. I gave my name to a clerk who entered it into a data slate without looking at me, and I stood in a line with 300 other volunteers, miners and laborers and fabrication workers, people who had looked at Crucivael in the aftermath of Seismic Incident 7-7 and reached the same conclusion I had, and I waited for the shuttle that would take me to orbit. The decontamination process took 4 hours. They stripped us, scrubbed us with chemical agents that burned almost as badly as the atmosphere we were leaving, ran scanners over every centimeter of our bodies to check for parasitic organisms or chemical contamination that might spread to other worlds. 2 people in the processing line were pulled out and sent to a quarantine bay. I never found out what they had that the rest of us did not. The rest of us were given uniforms, standard-issue Imperial Guard kit that felt impossibly light after a lifetime of heavy-weave Crucivael work clothes, and marched onto a shuttle that smelled of recycled air and engine lubricant and something else, something I could not identify, that I eventually realized was the absence of chemical bitterness. Clean air. I was breathing air that did not taste like it was trying to corrode my throat. For the first time in 21 years of life. Clean, filtered, shipboard air that tasted of nothing, and I breathed it in, and my lungs did not know what to do with it. The shuttle lifted off. Through the tiny viewport beside my seat, I watched Crucivael fall away beneath me. The red light of Moriven painted the planet's surface in shades of rust and dried blood, and the cloud layer, thick with chemical vapor, obscured the Vedden escarpment within seconds of our ascent. Red cloud over red rock under a red sun. And then we were above the atmosphere, and the planet was a sphere below us, and then it was a dot, and then it was nothing. I thought at the time that I was leaving it behind. I was wrong about that. Crucivael was not finished with me. The Imperial Guard takes the broken and the desperate from 10,000 worlds and turns them into something just functional enough to hold a last gun and stand in a line, and then it feeds them into whatever meat grinder the Departamento Munitorum has selected that season. I was assigned to the 1st Crucivael, a regiment that was less a regiment and more a collection of tithe leftovers from multiple cycles, consolidated under a single designation because Crucivael did not produce enough soldiers in any given cycle to form a proper regiment on its own. We were 3,000 men and women, most of us miners, a handful of fabrication workers, and me, the only seal keeper who had ever volunteered. Our commanding officer was a colonel named Vedden Strave, a career guardsman who had been assigned to the 1st Crucivael because someone in the Munitorum had decided that a regiment of half-poisoned miners from a death world needed an experienced hand, and Strave was experienced in the way that a blade is experienced, worn thin by use but still capable of cutting. He was from Mordian, a world that bred its soldiers as hard as Crucivael bred its dead, and he looked at us with the flat assessment of a man who has seen worse and expects to see worse again. Training was conducted on a transit ship called the Resolute Accordance, a troop transport that was making the run from the Gelvar Reach to the Segmentum Obscurus with 8 regiments in its holds. We trained in the cargo bays, which were cavernous spaces that echoed with the sound of guns discharging into practice targets and drill sergeants screaming instructions in a dialect of Low Gothic that half of us could barely understand. I learned to shoot. I learned to dig a foxhole, which was ironic given where I came from. I learned to move in formation, to follow orders without thinking, to suppress every instinct that told me to run, and replace it with the mechanical discipline of advance, fire, advance, fire. I was not a natural soldier. I was not fast, not aggressive, not possessed of the fury that makes a good assault trooper. But I was durable. 21 years on Crucivael had made me that. I could endure conditions that made other recruits vomit or collapse. I could work for 20 hours without rest. I could function in environments so toxic that the standard issue rebreather could not keep up. And I could maintain calm in situations of absolute chaos because I had been raised in a world where absolute chaos was the weather. Colonel Tesk noticed. He did not praise me. Tesk did not praise anyone. But he moved me to a specialist role within the regiment, a position called Atmospheric Operations, which was a polite way of saying that I was the person they sent into the places where the air was bad. Chemically contaminated zones, post-bombardment areas where the detonation products had not yet dissipated, underground tunnel networks where ventilation had failed. Anywhere the atmosphere was hostile, I was there, because I was the man from the planet where the atmosphere was always hostile. And 21 years of breathing trace contaminants had given me a tolerance that the Munitorum medics described as anomalous, and I described as the only useful inheritance my father ever gave me. The first Crucivael saw its first combat on a world called Vedden Secundus, a hive world in the Thracian subsector that had been invaded by an orc war of moderate size. I will not describe the fighting in great detail because combat is, at its core, boringly repetitive. You advance, you shoot, people die. Sometimes they are the enemy. Sometimes they are the person standing next to you. The noise is indescribable, not because it is loud, which it is, but because it is constant, a wall of sound that batters you until your brain stops trying to process it and simply accepts it as a new form of silence. The orcs were large and green and violent and died when you put enough lasfire into them, which was more lasfire than you would expect, given their size and their apparent indifference to pain. The fighting in the lower hive was the worst, tight corridors and collapsed infrastructure that funneled both sides into kill zones, where the only tactic was volume of fire, and the only outcome was attrition. The first Crucivael lost 400 soldiers on Vedden Secundus. I was not one of them, not through any particular skill or bravery, but through the same mechanism that had kept me alive on Crucivael: endurance. I endured. After Vedden Secundus came Volgan's Reach, a border world harassed by dark Eldar raiders, and then Prellath III, a fortress world on the edge of a minor warp storm that needed its garrison reinforced. 3 campaigns in 2 years. The first Crucivael shrank with each one, replacing losses with consolidated remnants from other decimated regiments, until the original Crucivael contingent was barely half the regiment's strength. I rose in rank, not because I sought it, but because the people above me kept dying. I was a corporal after Vedden Secundus, a sergeant after Volgan's Reach. My leadership style, such as it was, consisted of telling people what needed to be done in the fewest possible words, and then doing it alongside them until it was done. It was not inspiring. It was functional. And in the Guard, functional keeps people alive, which is more than inspiration can claim. Then came Castabrin, and Castabrin changed things. Castabrin was a mining colony in the Delvan Corridor, a world that produced rare earth minerals for the Mechanicus forge networks. A Gene's Stealer cult had been identified in the lower excavation levels, and the first Crucivael was deployed alongside 3 other regiments to cleanse the infestation. The fighting was ugly, as Gene's Stealer operations always are. Close quarters tunnel combat against things that were fast and strong and driven by a hunger that had nothing to do with food. But the fighting is not what I remember about Castorbryn. What I remember is what I found in the tunnels. The first Crucivael was assigned to clear the deepest excavation shafts because deep tunnels with bad air were our specialty, courtesy of me and the handful of other Crucivael veterans who were still breathing. On the 4th day of operations, my squad pushed into a section of the mine that the Gene's Stealer cult had not yet penetrated, a sealed industrial wing that bore the unmistakable markers of Mechanicus construction: heavy blast doors, hermetic containment protocols, warning sigils in binary cant that I could not read but recognized by shape. The doors were sealed from the inside, which meant they had been locked down deliberately, which meant whatever was behind them was something the Mechanicus valued enough to protect, even during a Xenos infestation. We breached the doors because our orders were to clear every section, and what I found on the other side stopped me in a way that no Gene's Stealer ever had. It was an injection facility. A massive chamber carved into the deepest bedrock of Castorbryn, filled with industrial piping and pressure vessels and catalytic mixing tanks. I did not need a schematic to understand what I was looking at. Velgate had described this process to me and Orath in her cramped quarters on level 5, not the machinery itself, which she had never seen, but what the machinery did. Compounds introduced into the planetary mantle, catalytic agents to accelerate the chemical reactions in the deep rock, bore heads driven down through the crust to the layers where the heat and pressure did their work. And here it all was, made physical. Reservoir tanks feeding into injection assemblies that ran down into capped bore shafts, descending into the bedrock. The Mechanicus was doing to Castorbryn exactly what it was doing to Crucivael, pumping catalytic accelerants into the planet's mantle to increase mineral yield, manufacturing geological instability, poisoning the atmosphere, turning a mining world into a slow-motion death sentence for its human population. And then I noticed something else. The injection facility was old, decades old at minimum, judging by the corrosion patterns on the lower pipe housings. But it was not operational. The mixing tanks were empty. The bore heads were capped. The facility had been shut down, dismantled in an orderly fashion, the way you decommission a system that has served its purpose and is no longer needed. On the wall near the main control console, someone had left a maintenance log in standard Mechanicus notation. I could not read most of it, but I could read the numbers, and the last entry was dated 17 years ago. 17 years before the Gene's Stealer cult had been discovered. 17 years before the military intervention that would depopulate the colony. I stood in that chamber, and I looked at the dead equipment, and I thought about timing. The Mechanicus stops the injections. 17 years later, the cult appears. The military comes. The miners die or scatter. And the Mechanicus inherits an empty world with mineral deposits that have been artificially enriched over decades of catalytic acceleration. A world that no longer needs a human workforce because the difficult geological work has already been done. All it needs now is servitors and automated extraction rigs. I did not know if I was right. I still do not know. Gene's Stealer. Cults are real. They emerge in mining colonies with a frequency that might mean vulnerability or might mean something else entirely. Maybe the cult on Castorbryn was exactly what it appeared to be, and the injection facility was a coincidence, and the timing meant nothing. Maybe. I reported the facility to Colonel Tesk. He looked at the report, looked at me, and told me to forget about it. The Mechanicus's internal operations were not the Guard's concern. He was right, technically. I made platoon sergeant after Castor Bryn. Through all of it, I thought about Crucivael, not constantly, not obsessively, but in the quiet moments, the ones between campaigns when the regiment was in transit, and there was nothing to do but sit in the hold and listen to the ship's engines and think. Crucivael came back to me. The red light, the tunnel walls, the taste of contaminated air, my father's hands, Orath's face as the Skitarii led him away, Velgate's nod, the 19,000, the kelastrine shards that caught the light and turned it into colors I did not have names for. All of it, preserved in my memory with a clarity that nothing in my guard service could match, because Crucivael had been my world in a way that no battlefield would ever be. The battlefields were places I passed through. Crucivael was the place that had made me. I heard rumors. Guardsmen hear rumors the way filters process air, constantly, automatically, and most of it is contaminated. But some of the rumors that filtered through the first Crucivael's barracks in the months after Castor Breen had a consistency that made me pay attention. Unrest in the Gelvon Reach, disturbances on several mining worlds, labor disruptions that had escalated beyond the capacity of local arbiters to manage, names of worlds I did not recognize, and one name that I did, Crucivael. Something was happening on Crucivael. The rumors were vague, contradictory, the way rumors always are when they have traveled through multiple relay stations and been garbled by distance and interpretation. But the word that came up most often was a word that, in the context of the Imperium, carried a weight disproportionate to its 4 syllables. Rebellion. I tried to find out more. Guardsmen do not have access to strategic intelligence briefings. Our information came from mess hall conversations, intercepted Vox chatter, and the occasional comment from an officer who had been drinking more than regulations allowed. What I pieced together was fragmentary. There had been an incident on Crucivael. The mining population had organized some form of resistance to Mechanicus authority. The Mechanicus had requested military intervention. A response was being assembled. I told myself it was not my concern. I was a guardsman. Crucivael was a world I had left 4 years ago. The people I had known there were dead or vanished. Whatever was happening on that red rock under that dying sun was happening to strangers, and I had enough strangers dying around me in the Guard without adding more. But the hollow place in my chest, the one that Orath's absence had carved and my father's death had deepened, that place recognized the shape of what was happening, and it would not let me look away. The orders came 6 weeks later. Colonel Tesk assembled the regiment in the primary hold of our transport ship, a retrofitted bulk carrier called the Penance of Theladros, and he told us that the first Crucivael, along with elements of 6 other regiments, was being redeployed to the Gelvaon Reach to participate in what the Departamento Munitorum was calling a compliance action on a mining world designated Crucivael. A compliance action. That was the word they used. Suppress the rebellion, kill the miners and the seal keepers and the vapor readers and the fabrication workers who had risen up against the Mechanicus that was poisoning their world and killing them by inches. And for the crime of objecting to their own slow murder, they were to be brought into compliance. By me, by the first Crucivael, the regiment raised from the very planet it was now being sent to pacify. They were sending me home, not as a liberator, not as a returning son, as a weapon. The penance of Theladros entered warp transit. The Gellar fields held. Somewhere in the guts of those Gellar field generators, kelastrine components hummed with the crystalline vibration that kept the warp at bay. Kelastrine from Crucivael, mined by people like my father. processed at the cost of their air and their lungs and their lives, and now the ship that carried me home was protected by the mineral that had been purchased with their suffering. The Imperium wastes nothing, not even irony. We translated back into real space 14 days later, and Crucivael was there in the viewport, exactly as I had left it. Red world under a red sun, wrapped in clouds of chemical vapor, unremarkable and hideous and mine. The sight of it produced a physical response that I was not prepared for. My chest tightened. My hands, which had held a las gun steady through 4 campaigns and countless firefights, trembled. And the taste came back, the chemical bitterness on the back of my tongue, even though I was breathing filtered shipboard air and Crucivael's atmosphere was still thousands of kilometers below me. Memory is a cruel organ. It records things you do not want and replays them at the worst possible moments. And in that moment, standing at a viewport on the penance of Theladros, my body remembered Crucivael before my mind could prepare for it. The tactical briefing was conducted en route to the drop zone. A Mechanicus liaison, a tech adept called Logis Garadine Vox Null, stood at the front of the briefing hall and delivered the situation report in the flat, emotionless monotone of someone whose vocal cords had been replaced with a Vox synthesizer. The briefing was clinical. The mining population of Crucivael had initiated an armed insurrection against Mechanicus authority approximately 7 months ago. The insurrection had been contained to the Vedden escarpment hab complexes, but had spread to encompass the majority of the surviving population. The rebels had seized control of the mineral extraction infrastructure, the atmospheric filtration systems, and the transit hub, effectively making them self-sufficient within the sealed environment. Mechanicus personnel had been evacuated to a secure facility at the northern end of the escarpment. The rebels were armed with improvised weapons and a small number of captured Skitarii arms. Their organization was assessed as rudimentary but effective. Their leadership was identified as a former mining caste worker named Orath Dennett. I heard his name and felt nothing. That is not true. I felt everything. But everything came at once, compressed into a single instant of recognition and horror and something that might have been relief, because at least he was alive. And the result of feeling everything simultaneously was a kind of white noise of emotion that my body interpreted as nothing. Orath was alive. Orath was leading a rebellion. Orath, who had been taken by the Skitarii 5 years ago, who had vanished into the Mechanicus's apparatus and never come back, was somehow alive and free and standing at the head of an armed insurrection on a planet whose secret he had spent months trying to reveal. The story had a shape that I recognized, a narrative coherence that, on Crucivael, should have been my first warning. The compliance action was structured as a standard urban suppression operation. The 7 regiments assigned to the task force would insert at multiple points along the escarpment, secure the exterior approaches, and then advance through the hab complexes in a systematic clearance. Rules of engagement were defined as pacification level, which in Guard terminology meant that lethal force was authorized against anyone who resisted, and that the definition of resistance was deliberately broad enough to encompass essentially any behavior short of immediate surrender. The objective was the restoration of Mechanicus authority over the extraction infrastructure. The disposition of the civilian population was described in the briefing as secondary to the operational objective, which was another piece of clean administrative language that meant their lives did not matter. The first Crucivael was assigned to the central escarpment sector, which included hab costs 10 through 15. My sector, my home. I was going to clear the corridors I had grown up in, kick down the doors of quarters where people I had known still lived, and point a las gun at faces that might recognize mine. Colonel Tesk knew this. He had read my service file. He knew I was from Hab Karst 12. and he assigned me to the central sector anyway, because the 1st Crucivael was the regiment with the most experience operating in toxic atmosphere conditions, and the central sector was where the atmospheric seals were most likely to be compromised during the fighting, and Platoon Sergeant Vedden Strave was the man you sent when the air was bad. My expertise was my curse. The thing that Crucivael had made me was the thing that would bring me back to destroy it. We dropped in Valkyries, 20 soldiers per transport, screaming through Crucivael's chemical atmosphere in vehicles that shook so violently I was certain the airframe was going to tear apart before we reached the escarpment. The air outside the Valkyrie was a brown-yellow murk that reduced visibility to nothing. The pilot was flying on instruments alone, navigating by geological survey data that was 4 years old and possibly inaccurate, heading for a landing zone on the escarpment ridge above Habkarst 12. We hit the ground hard enough to rattle my teeth, and the rear ramp dropped, and the air of Crucivael came rushing in, and my lungs recognized it immediately. The bitterness, the chemical sting, the taste of home. The exterior of the escarpment was unchanged, or nearly so. The Hab complex structures were still bolted to the cliff face, their sealed doors and observation ports visible through the haze. But the atmosphere was worse than I remembered. The vapor was thicker, more corrosive. My rebreather, guard issue and rated for far harsher conditions than most battlefields offered, was working at near capacity, just filtering the ambient air. Whatever the Mechanicus had been doing to Crucivael's mantle in the years since I had left, they had not stopped. If anything, they had accelerated. And there was something new on the escarpment, something that had not been there when I left. At the northern end, beyond the last Hab complex, where the Mechanicus had established their secure facility, I could see shapes through the chemical murk. Industrial structures, massive frames of metal and ceramite, partially assembled, rising from prefabricated foundations that had been drilled into the escarpment ridge. Even through the poor visibility, I recognized what they were, because I had seen the same kind of structures on Casterbrin, deactivated and rusted but identical in design. Automated deep-bore extraction rigs, servitor-operated mining platforms designed to access mineral deposits without human labor. Each one was enormous, 3 or 4 times the size of the largest Hab complex on the escarpment, and there were at least 6 of them in various stages of assembly. I stared at them through the haze, and I felt the cold thing in my chest, the kelastrine hatred, vibrate like a tuning fork. Those rigs had not been shipped to Crucivael in the 7 months since the rebellion started. Equipment of that size, from Forge worlds that operated on multi-year production schedules, took years to manufacture, transport, and pre-stage. Someone had ordered those rigs long before the first rebel picked up a mining tool as a weapon. Someone had planned for Crucivael to be empty. We entered Habkarst 12 through an emergency access hatch on the roof, and the fighting started almost immediately. The people of Crucivael fought with a ferocity that none of the intelligence briefings had predicted. These were miners and seal keepers and fabrication workers, people whose combat training consisted of whatever they had improvised in 7 months of rebellion, and they fought like cornered animals because they were cornered animals. They knew what compliance meant. They had seen the Skitarii take their neighbors. They had lived through Seismic Incident 7-7 and the years of worsening conditions that followed it. They had nothing left to lose, and people with nothing to lose do not surrender. They fight until they cannot fight anymore, and then they fight a little longer, and the cost of killing them is measured not just in their blood, but in yours. My platoon lost 8 soldiers in the first 3 hours. I lost them in corridors I had walked as a child, in maintenance tunnels where I had checked seals, in the corridor junction on level 4, where Orath and I had sat eating nutrition paste and talking about tremor patterns. A woman with a mining pick came at me from a doorway on level 3, and I shot her, and she fell, and I stepped over her body and kept moving because stopping was dying. And I did not look at her face because I was afraid I would recognize it. By the end of the first day, the upper levels of Hab Karst 12 were secured, but the lower levels were held by a large group of rebels who had barricaded themselves into the main filtration engine bay, a reinforced compartment that was effectively a fortress within the Hab complex. They had sealed every access point with improvised barriers made from mining equipment and structural bracing. And the corridors approaching the engine bay were kill zones that cost us 11 soldiers to learn were impassable. The order came from the Mechanicus liaison. Logus Vox Null transmitted it directly to Colonel Tesk, who relayed it to the sector commanders, who relayed it to me. The order was to breach the exterior seals on the lower levels of Hab Karst 12, break the atmospheric barriers, let Crucivael's air into the rebel-held sections. The vapor would do what the last guns could not. The rebels had no rebreathers. They had no protection against the atmosphere they had spent their entire lives sealed away from. Weeper, Rotgut, Grandmother, the whole chemical arsenal of Crucivael's poison sky pumped into sealed compartments where hundreds of people were hiding. It would take minutes. The order came to me specifically because I was atmospheric operations, because I was the seal keeper, because I knew where every junction was, how each one worked, which seals to break to create the fastest and most thorough atmospheric incursion. Half a lifetime of keeping seals whole, the only trade my father ever taught me, and the machine wanted me to use it to break them. I told Colonel Tesk that I could not execute the order. I did not say would not. I said could not, and the distinction mattered because Commissar Heil was standing 3 meters from Tesk's shoulder, and Commissar Heil had already shot 2 Crucivael-born troopers in the first day of the operation, men who had frozen when they recognized a face among the rebels. The Commissariat does not attach a political officer to a regiment fighting its own homeworld by accident. Heil watched all of us, and watched the Crucivael men most of all, and a man in my position who said would not, would be dead before the word finished leaving his mouth. So I said could not. I told Tesk that breaching the lower seals would compromise atmospheric integrity across the entire Hab complex, not just the rebel-held sections. That the ventilation systems in Hab Karst 12 were interconnected, and a lower-level breach would eventually contaminate the upper levels where our own troops were operating. It was true. It was also not the reason. Hale's eyes were on me the whole time, looking for the lie under the engineering, and I gave him nothing but engineering, because engineering was the only thing that would keep me breathing. Tesk looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Heil, and something passed between them that I was not party to, and the colonel reassigned the task to a combat engineer squad from the 44th Voskan, soldiers who did not know what a seal junction was and did not care, who treated the atmospheric barriers as obstacles rather than lifelines. They breached the lower seals with melta charges, crude and excessive, and the escarpment's atmosphere came flooding into the lower levels of Hab Karst 12 with the eagerness of something that had been pressing against the walls for decades, waiting for its chance. I was on level 3 when it happened. I heard the breach before I felt it, a deep concussive sound that resonated through the walls, followed by a change in air pressure that made my ears pop. Then the chemical bite, even through my rebreather, a sharpening of the bitterness that told me the containment had failed and the outside was getting in. And from below, from the lower levels where the rebels were barricaded, other sounds. Coughing at first, then screaming, then sounds that I will not describe because you do not need to hear them and I do not want to remember them. Sounds that human throats should not make, sounds that went on for longer than I would have believed possible, and then stopped all at once, which was worse. The lower-level breach also did something that the Voskan engineers had not anticipated, and that I would have told them about if anyone had asked the Sealkeeper for his opinion on breaking seals. The breach let in more than air. It let in the kelk, the parasitic organisms that clung to the exterior of the hab complexes, drawn by heat and energy signatures, had been pressing against the lower wall sections for years. The sealed walls kept them out. The melta-breached walls did not. Within hours of the atmospheric breach, kelk colonies began pushing through the damaged sections, their acid secretions accelerating the structural degradation, their knotted sinew bodies filling the lower corridors like tumors growing in real time. By the second day, the lower 3 levels of Hab-Karst 12 were effectively lost, not to the rebels who were all dead, but to the biology of Crucivael itself. The planet had been invited in, and it had accepted the invitation with enthusiasm. It was during the second day, while my platoon was establishing a containment perimeter to keep the Kelch infestation from spreading to the upper levels, that I went into the maintenance tunnels for the last time. I told myself it was operational. The tunnels ran along the exterior wall, and if the Kelch were compromising the structure from the outside, the tunnels were where the damage would show first. It was a valid concern. It was also a pretext, because the tunnel I chose to inspect was the one that ran past Junction 37, on Level 4. My father's junction. The tunnel was dark. The amber lighting strips had failed, and I navigated by the lamp mounted on my rebreather rig, the beam cutting through dust and chemical haze. I reached Junction 37, and it was intact, which was meaningless since there was no longer anyone on the other side who needed the air it was keeping clean. And then I saw it. Behind the junction housing, in the narrow gap between the seal mount and the tunnel wall, where a maintenance access panel had been left slightly ajar, there was a data slate. It was old. The casing was corroded, the screen cracked in one corner, and the power cell was nearly dead. But when I activated it, it lit up, and the screen showed a document in my father's handwriting. My father, who spoke in short sentences and did not waste words, had written over 40 pages. Atmospheric compound readings logged daily, going back 23 years. Not the official readings from the monitoring stations, his own readings taken with a portable chemical analyzer that he must have acquired or built or stolen, logged in the margins of his seal maintenance notes where no one would think to look. 23 years of data. 23 years of evidence that the atmospheric contamination was increasing at a rate that could not be natural. He had known, long before Velgate, long before Orath, long before me. He had known, and he had documented it in silence, alone, in a tunnel behind a seal junction. And he had told no one, not even me. I took the data slate and put it inside my armor against my chest. Then I went back to my platoon and continued the compliance action. I found Orath on the third day. He was in Hab-Karst 14, which the 32nd Mordian had cleared ahead of our advance. They had set up a processing center in the main nutrition dispensary, where captured rebels were being catalogued before transfer to the holding area at the northern end of the escarpment. Orath was the named leader of the insurrection, and by every rule of war he should have been isolated, interrogated, kept apart. But the Guard processed prisoners by capture location, not by name, and the men of the 32nd Mordian had no particular interest in which of these poisoned, half-starved miners had been giving the speeches. To them, he was one more body in the queue. The Mechanicus would sort the leadership out at the holding facility. Until then, Orath sat against the wall with the rest of them, waiting his turn to be catalogued, and that was the only reason I was able to reach him at all. I was passing through on my way to a meeting with Colonel Tesk when I saw him. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the dispensary wall, his wrists bound with mag cuffs, his face thinner than I remembered, older, harder. He had a scar on his left cheek that had not been there when we were young, a thick, raised line that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw. His eyes were closed. He looked like he was sleeping. I said his name. He opened his eyes and he looked at me, and for 3 or 4 seconds there was nothing in his face. No recognition, no emotion. Just the flat exhaustion of a man who has been fighting for 7 months and has just lost. Then he saw the uniform. Then he saw my face. And his expression changed in a way that I cannot describe without using words that would sound false. So I will just say that he recognized me, and that the recognition hurt him in a way that the fighting had not. We talked, not long. A Mordian guard was watching us, and fraternization with captured rebels was not permitted, and I was a platoon sergeant with responsibilities that did not include having conversations with the enemy. But I had 5 minutes, and I used them, and in those 5 minutes Orath told me what had happened. After the Skitarii took him, he had been held in the Mechanicus facility at the northern end of the escarpment for 2 years. Interrogated, yes, but not harshly, not the way you would expect the Mechanicus to interrogate a dissident. They had asked him questions about who he had talked to, what he had said, how people had reacted. They had been thorough but not cruel. And then, after 2 years, they had released him back into the Hab complexes with no explanation, no conditions, no surveillance that he could detect. He had returned to Hab Karst 14, and within weeks he had resumed doing what he had been doing before his arrest. Talking, sharing information, spreading the truth about the catalytic injections and the manufactured atmospheric degradation. But this time the information was everywhere. Not just his conversations. Data slates had appeared in the Hab complexes, unsigned, containing Velgate's atmospheric analyses, the geological models, the evidence of Mechanicus tampering. The data was comprehensive, detailed, and formatted in a way that suggested it had been compiled by someone with access to resources far beyond what any Hab complex citizen possessed. Orath had assumed that Velgate had prepared and hidden the data before her arrest, that someone had found it and distributed it. The rebellion had grown from there, fueled by anger and evidence and the 19,000 dead of seismic incident 7-7. I listened to Orath, and I felt the shape of it. The shape that I had been sensing since the tactical briefing, the narrative coherence that should have been my first warning. I asked him one question. I asked him if, in the 2 years the Mechanicus had held him, they had ever asked him to stop. He looked at me, confused. I rephrased. Had they ever threatened him? Warned him about consequences? Told him what would happen if he continued spreading information after his release? He thought about it, and his face changed again, slowly, the way a seal keeper's face changes when he realizes that a gasket has been degrading for months, and the breach is already happening and it is too late to stop it. "No," he said, "they never told me to stop." And there it was, the second truth, the one that was worse than the first, because it made the first truth into something even more monstrous. It came together in my head the way a seal failure propagates, each piece connecting to the next in a chain of recognition that accelerated until the whole picture was exposed. Orath's gentle interrogation and unexplained release. The data slates that had appeared across the Hab complexes, with Velgate's analysis formatted in Mechanicus standard notation. The kind of formatting that a Schola instructor with failing lungs could never have produced. The kind that required Mechanicus data processing tools and Mechanicus distribution networks. The automated deep-bore extraction rigs I had seen on the escarpment ridge, pre-staged, partially assembled, equipment that took years to manufacture and transport, ordered long before any rebellion existed. And Casterbrin, the dead injection facility on Casterbrin, decommissioned 17 years before a conveniently discovered genes-stealer cult, gave the Imperium reason to depopulate the colony. The same pattern, the same shape, the same calculation. Velgate had not hidden her data before the Skitarii took her. She had not prepared a secret archive that some loyal citizen had later found and distributed. The Mechanicus had taken Velgate, and they had extracted everything she knew, every analysis, every data point, every conclusion she had spent decades accumulating. They had taken her knowledge the way they took kelastrine from the rock, refined it, processed it, and turned it into a product. Then they had distributed it themselves. The data slates that had appeared in the hab complexes, the ones that had ignited the rebellion, were Mechanicus products, manufactured from the raw material of Velgate's life's work, formatted and distributed on a schedule designed to produce maximum outrage at the precise moment the Mechanicus needed outrage to justify depopulation. Velgate had not died for the truth. The truth had been taken from her body, polished, and used as a weapon against the people she had tried to protect. I do not know if she was alive when they finished extracting what they needed. I do not know if they kept her or disposed of her or converted her into a servitor that now tended the automated systems that were replacing the workforce she had tried to save. The Mechanicus does not publish the disposition of its raw materials. And my father with his 23 years of atmospheric data hidden behind Junction 37. Had the Mechanicus known about him too? I would never know. But the shape fit. The Mechanicus had not failed to contain the rebellion. They had cultivated it. They had spent 200 years extracting kelastrine from Crucivael using human miners, and now the extraction was reaching a threshold beyond which human involvement was no longer necessary. The servitor-operated deep-bore systems on the ridge could access the deposits without the logistical burden of maintaining a human population. 600,000 people who required hab complexes, atmospheric seals, filtration systems, nutrition allocation, and all the other infrastructure of human survival were no longer an asset. They were an expense. But you cannot simply exterminate a population. Not even the Mechanicus can do that without consequences. There are protocols. There are authorities that must be satisfied. The administratum requires justification. The Inquisition asks questions. If 600,000 people die without reason, someone, eventually, will want to know why. Unless those 600,000 people are rebels. Unless they have risen in armed insurrection against the lawful authority of the Adeptus Mechanicus, in violation of their oaths of compliance, in defiance of imperial law. Rebellion is one of the very few crimes for which the Imperium's response is absolute and unappealable. A rebel world is a world that has forfeited its right to exist. The military response to rebellion is not proportional. It is total. And when the compliance action is complete and the population is gone, and the hab complexes are empty, the Mechanicus can begin automated extraction operations without explanation or justification, or the inconvenient moral arithmetic of 600,000 names on a ledger. The rebellion was real. The people's anger was real. Their cause was just. Everything Orath had fought for, everything Velgate had been destroyed for, was true. The Mechanicus was poisoning Crucivael. The atmospheric degradation was manufactured. The deaths were unnecessary. All of that was real. But the rebellion itself, the organized resistance, the armed insurrection that had given the Imperium the legal pretext to send 7 regiments to kill everyone on the Corvadan escarpment, that had been engineered as precisely and as deliberately as the catalytic injections in the planet's mantle. The truth had been weaponized. The righteous anger of a poisoned people had been channeled and shaped and aimed, and the trigger had been pulled not by Orath or by any rebel leader, but by a Mechanicus strategist who had calculated that the cost of manufacturing a rebellion was less than the cost of maintaining a workforce. Casterbrin and its convenient genes, Stealer cult. Crucivael and its convenient insurrection. The Mechanicus could not have grown the cult on Castor Bryn. No one can grow a genes-stealer cult, but they did not need to. They only needed to let it spread, to look away while it took root in a population they had already decided to discard, and then to act surprised when it surfaced. On Crucivael, they did not have a cult to wait for, so they built their crisis out of the only raw material that was already there. Our anger, the truth, each other. And how many others were there? How many mining worlds across the Imperium had been enriched and emptied by this same arithmetic, the same slow poisoning, the same crisis arriving exactly when the Mechanicus needed it, whether they lit the fire themselves or merely stood back and let it burn. The pattern was not unique to Crucivael. Crucivael was just the one I had been born inside. I told Orath. I told him because he deserved to know, and because Velgate would have told him, and because in that moment I was not a guardsman and he was not a rebel. We were two boys from Hab Cars 12 who had learned a terrible truth and had been destroyed by it in different ways. He listened. His face was still. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that I have carried with me ever since. Something that I hear in my head every time I close my eyes. He said, "It does not matter. They used us. They used the truth. They built our rebellion like they built the kelastrine, by injecting poison and waiting for the reaction. But the people who died in the corridors did not die for the Mechanicus's plan. They died because they were angry, and they were right to be angry. And they chose to fight because fighting was better than breathing poisoned air in silence for another generation. The Mechanicus can use that. They can profit from it. They can turn our anger into their pretext. But they cannot make it theirs. It was ours. It is still ours. The Imperial Guard told me my time was up. I stood. Orath looked up at me from the floor, and he smiled, and it was the same smile I remembered from 1,000 off shifts in a corridor junction on level 4. The smile of a man who sees things clearly and finds them absurd and does not look away. I never saw him again. The captured rebels were processed through the compliance apparatus. Some were executed. Some were sent to penal legions. Some simply disappeared into the same void that had swallowed Velgate. I do not know which category Orath fell into. I did not ask. Asking would not have changed anything, and I had learned that lesson long before I ever held a las gun. The compliance action on Crucivael lasted 19 days. When it was over, the Vedden escarpment was empty. 600,000 people, reduced to whatever fraction had survived and been processed and shipped off-world to whatever fate the Administratum had assigned them. The Hab complexes stood sealed and dark, their corridors scoured, their quarters emptied. On the 19th day, while the last Guard regiments were consolidating for extraction, the automated deep-bore rigs at the northern end of the escarpment activated. I heard them from Hab Karst 12, a deep industrial drone that resonated through the rock, and I recognized the shape of it because I had heard its smaller cousin before. The low, sustained pulse, the artificial heartbeat that did not fit any natural pattern, the wrongness in the tremors that my father had felt before I did, that I had felt before I understood. That had been the injection machinery, the bore heads driving the catalysts down into the mantle, the sound of the planet being worked to death from the inside. For most of our lives, it had hidden inside the natural rhythm of the tremors, indistinguishable from the planet's own grinding. It was only when they accelerated the injections, in those last years, that the artificial pulse pushed through and we felt it as something that did not belong, without ever knowing what it was. The rigs were the same machinery turned to a different purpose, boring instead of injecting, taking out what 2 centuries of poison had grown, and now they were running at full operational capacity, unmasked. The sound of Crucivael's future, a future in which the kelastrine was extracted. The catalytic compounds were injected without any pretense of atmospheric management. The fissures were allowed to widen, and the air was allowed to turn to pure corrosive vapor because there was nobody left to breathe it and nobody left to maintain the seals. I boarded the shuttle that took me back to orbit. I sat in the same kind of seat I had sat in 4 years earlier. Through the viewport, I watched Crucivael fall away beneath me, the red light of Moorhaven, the chemical clouds, the escarpment barely visible through the haze, and on its ridge, the shapes of the extraction rigs, already working, their drill heads boring into the rock that still held the bodies of the people who had been recycled into its nutrition systems for 200 years. My father's data slate was against my chest, under my armor. 40 pages of a dead man's silent testimony that proved nothing to anyone who did not already know the truth, and that changed nothing for anyone who did. I kept it anyway. I keep it still. Not because it matters, because he wrote it and someone should know that he did, and I am the only one left who can say so. You asked me what the worst planet in the Imperium is. Now you know. It is not the one with the deadliest atmosphere or the most hostile biology or the most unstable geology. Though Crucivael has all of those. It is not the one that kills the most people, though Crucivael did that too. The worst planet in the Imperium is the one that makes you understand that your suffering was never an accident, that it was a calculation, that every breath of poisoned air and every seal breach and every seismic event and every death was a line item on a spreadsheet, and that the spreadsheet balanced, and that the balance was considered acceptable by people who would never set foot on the world they were destroying. The planet does not mourn. The planet endures, the Imperium endures, and neither of them will ever ask whether the cost was too high. Crucivael still exists. The kelastrine is still mined. The Gellar fields still hold, and somewhere in the Imperium, right now, a ship is traversing the warp in safety because of minerals that were purchased with the lives of people whose names were never recorded and whose deaths were never mourned. That is the worst planet in the Imperium, and I was born there.